It's 6 a.m. on the morning of the 10th of May 2014. Almost 13 years after the worst terrorist attack in America's history, 3 caskets containing the human remains of 9/11 victims are being transported to Ground Zero. Over 2,700 people lost their lives here on the 11th of September 2001. Most of the bodies were reduced to unrecognizable fragments. In the aftermath of the attacks, America's largest forensic investigation began.
We found, an arm over here, a leg over there, just pieces.
Ever since, New York's medical examiners have pushed the boundaries of forensic pathology to identify almost 14,000 human remains.
And that's obviously his hair and his scalp. There's 3 teeth there.
But today, over 1,100 victims are still missing, lost without a trace.
By now, I expected to get some kind of remains, but you just kind of have to accept that you don't have any.
I don't have any physical remains at all. No grave to go to.
As the latest phase of testing comes to an end, will they find a way to identify and return the missing bodies to grieving families?
Whatever the techniques are out there, anywhere on the planet, we're going to apply to World Trade Center.
This is the untold story of the biggest forensic examination in American criminal history. With unique access to the scientists who are still 13 years later working to bring closure to the families of 9/11. New York, the office of the Chief Medical Examiner, home to the city's crime scene investigators.
The Office of Chief Medical Examiner is responsible for determining the cause of death of anyone who dies within the city of New York. And this could be suspicious death, such as a homicide. It could be someone who just dies in the street.
They investigate over 5,000 deaths every year. Today, their forensic biology lab is run by Dr. Mark Desire.
We've got one of the best crime labs, most advanced crime labs in the world.
Their caseload is huge and varied. Yet for the past 13 years, an entire department has been working on just one case, identifying the victims of 9/11. And they're still working on it.
This is the largest forensic investigation, in the history of New York City and the history of the United States.
This extraordinary inquiry has pushed back the boundaries of forensic science. But the latest phase of testing is coming to an end. And for the 1,115 families still waiting for their loved ones' remains, time is running out. At 8:50 on the morning of 11th of September 2001, the team at New York's medical examiner's office was sitting down to their regular weekly meeting.
We had a knock on the door, and one of my staff members wanted to know if he could go downtown with the medical examiners to help set up a temporary morgue because a small plane had hit one of the World Trade Center buildings and there was fire.
Over in the crime lab, staff rushed to the windows. The Twin Towers were clearly visible 5 miles away.
And then the North Tower was on fire. Smoke was coming out of the North Tower. And as we were watching, we saw the second plane hit right in front of us. Our team leader came bursting in and said, "We gotta go."
Mark raced to the scene. It was clear there were going to be fatalities. Both towers were still standing when he arrived just before 10 a.m.
We were going to set a temporary morgue across the street from the South Tower, and it hadn't been 3 seconds after Dr. Hirsch had given us instructions, and he had sort of turned around to look at the South Tower, and that's when the South Tower cracked. The first floor was right over our heads. When I first saw it, I thought, that was it. This is how I'm going to die. As the debris started to rain down on us, hitting my head and then just knocked me into the building and fell onto my legs and crushed my foot, knocked me out of my shoes. Until your adrenaline was running so high, they weren't feeling any pain. I had no clue until hours later that my foot was even broken.
The Twin Towers collapsed, scattering millions of tons of rubble across 16 acres, burying victims under piles of dust and debris. No one knew how many people had died. This hellish crime scene represented the challenge of a lifetime for New York's emergency services. Within 2 hours, over 1,000 searchers were scouring Ground Zero for survivors. Amongst them was Deputy Fire Chief Jim Riches. He was desperate to find one man in particular, his firefighter son, Jimmy.
I came home that night and I told my wife, I said, there are people, they are going to find people. I'm almost certain. There's a lot of voids around. People are probably trapped and breathing there. We'll get to them. We're listening for them. And just never happened.
Only 18 people were ever recovered alive from Ground Zero. The search and rescue mission quickly became a hunt for the dead. But rescuers found few whole bodies.
We found arms, legs, people cut in half. We found one of my son's friends, bottom half was there. I looked in his wallet and we saw his name and put the wallet back in, so hopefully they can identify him and let the family have an identification. We never found the top half.
Victims had been torn apart and crushed by the collapsing towers. In the first 6 weeks, over 8,000 separate body parts were recovered from Ground Zero. The rapidly rising numbers of remains were taken to 16 refrigerated trailers, where scientists started examining them.
We had the range of sizes from something incredibly small, less than an inch long, to something which was a partial body, a torso or a head or a hand or a leg.
Eventually, Jim Riches found his son, Jimmy. Parts of his body lay 60 feet down, buried under tons of wreckage.
His helmet was crushed like a pancake, flat. And my son's body was in about 20 pieces. And we put them all together and we wrapped his body in an American flag on a stretcher. We walked up the pit, the ramp. It's probably about 200 yards long to walk up out of there. There were probably about 1,000 firemen on each side, lined up, saluting. I called my wife and I said, we found him. He's coming home. And it was good. I was glad to bury him, and I felt I had done my job.
But less than 10% of victims could be identified visually. Many of the fragments coming into the medical examiner's office were unrecognizable. The task seemed overwhelming.
Most of the work we did was bloodstain work, or saliva. I mean, not that we hadn't analyzed body parts, we certainly had, but not on this scale.
6 weeks after the attacks, just 500 people had been identified, mostly through fingerprints and dental records. Over 2,000 grieving families still had nothing. The pressure was on. But would the science be able to meet the challenge of identifying the victims?
I was getting worried because it was very clear to me that we weren't going to make many identifications if we didn't have a better way of testing them.
On the 11th of September 2001, Matt Campbell's brother Jeff was attending a conference at the World Trade Center.
Jeff was a year and a couple of weeks younger than me. From an early age, he was doing well academically at school. He was bright, very intellectual chap, but very sociable.
Jeff was a 31-year-old risk consultant for Reuters, building a life for himself in New York with fiancée Caroline.
6 weeks after we'd met, we decided to move in together. We were making plans to move over to England and probably start a family, but...
4 days after the attacks, the Campbells flew to New York. They scoured the city's hospitals with Caroline, hoping to find Jeff alive.
You know, going through my mind, I still kept thinking that there's a chance that he could be alive. You create fantasies in your head that, you know, maybe he's in a hospital in a coma and no one has identified him yet. You know, someone like him, who had such a nice, larger-than-life personality, it just didn't make sense that he was not on this planet anymore.
But when the family visited Ground Zero, a terrible truth became clear.
That is the
photo at the Crime Scene Echo. I mean, that's me, that's my wife, Mel, that's Caroline, and that's my mum there.
You looked up and you just knew there was absolutely no chance.
Yeah, just to sort of see nothing left was shocking, you know. Plus the fact that obviously Jeff is 100% dead, there's no way he'd survived.
Jeff's remains lay among tons of debris still strewn across Ground Zero. And so the Campbells returned home with nothing. But engineers with heavy hauling equipment were already starting to shift the rubble. On September the 12th, the decision had been made to move all the wreckage to a huge garbage dump 23 miles away on Staten Island, with the unfortunate name of Fresh Kills. Here they could carefully sort the debris to reveal the human remains. Dennis Diggins helped oversee the mammoth move.
It was overwhelming in the beginning. We immediately put about 1,500 people from the sanitation at Ground Zero to assist in moving material.
Debris was loaded onto trucks at Ground Zero, transferred to barges and shipped across Hudson Bay to Fresh Kills. It took 10 months to move all 1.8 million tons.
We were going to make sure that everything came in here was searched. It was just not even an option to us that we would leave material that wasn't searched.
Over 1,000 people worked round the clock, sifting through the grey debris for the smallest pieces of human remains.
We knew the importance of it. We knew what it meant to families. Everything was searched down to a quarter of an inch.
When the sifting operation at Fresh Kills ended on July the 26th, 2002, workers had recovered 4,257 body parts. These, along with approximately 19,000 found at Ground Zero, were taken to the medical examiner to be identified. After his dramatic escape on 9/11, Mark Desire went on to lead the forensic team.
The quickest way to identify an individual is visually through a photo. And then fingerprints and dental records are also very quick. Tattoos, scars, any identifying body marks.
But most 9/11 remains were too small or damaged. And for the forensic scientists, there was another almost overwhelming challenge.
The way the buildings fell, it became absolutely possible that there was going to be commingling of remains. One person dying on top of another person, decomposing, their tissues melting together, if you will.
The team's greatest hope lay with DNA. DNA testing is accurate, but takes longer to get results.
DNA is usually the fallback, and it has been traditionally. When no other method will work, use DNA because it's the longest, the most tedious, takes the most time.
In 7 months, the team had been able to identify 968 victims and return the body parts to their families. But it was impossible to keep up the pace.
I realized that the samples that coming into the laboratory were beginning to become badly decomposed because we had rubble that was hot and was moist because they were spraying it with water. And so this is a perfect place for biological material to decompose.
All of the things that destroy DNA were present at Ground Zero. And these include fire, heat, sunlight, water, insects, mold, bacteria, chemicals such as jet fuel, diesel fuel.
Crime scene investigators usually extract DNA from hair, nails, skin, or blood. But remains from Ground Zero often had no DNA left. Only one type of human tissue could be relied on to still preserve DNA: bone. This has been the focus of the inquiry ever since.
This is the start of the DNA process for World Trade Center identification. This is the bone grinding room. This is where we're going to take remains and pulverize them into a very fine powder. This is the first step, and it's a very important step. The finer the powder we can pulverize the remains into, the more access to the cells we're going to have. Bone material is some of the hardest of the biological materials to extract DNA from.
Initially, scientists used a pestle and mortar to grind samples of human bone into powder. Chemicals then broke down the cells until only strands of DNA were left. In these strands, scientists could identify a DNA profile unique to that person. But how were they to match these profiles to the victims?
The profile itself is pretty much worthless unless you have something to compare it to, and that's where the real power of DNA profiling comes in, being able to compare it to a data bank of reference samples and making matches.
The team needed to build up a database of victims' DNA. They asked families to come forward to provide samples, intimate personal items belonging to their loved ones.
We had razor blades, we had underwear, we had Kleenex, we had electric razors, anything and everything that might have biological material on it.
The most useful were toothbrushes.
You would get a DNA analysis of the cells in the toothbrush and compare it directly to the DNA profile of the remains. Most of our identifications came that way.
In the first year, the medical examiner's office identified remains from 1,432 victims and returned them home to their families. DNA was critical in 70% of the identifications. Amongst the remains sent back to families in 2002 was a single piece of collarbone that belonged to Jeff Campbell. It arrived on Maureen's birthday.
It actually gave me a bit of, not peace, but to think, yes, you know, Jeff is still around, as it were. He's remembered me on my birthday.
I honestly did not think that we would find anything. And I had made peace with that. But there is something to be said for having something identified. I don't like to call it closure. I don't like to say it helps to move on, but it does make a difference.
The Campbells now wanted to give Jeff a Catholic burial. But they were told they needed at least 3 body parts. They only had 1 bone.
We didn't know how many other parts were going to be identified, and so we didn't know what to do, in terms of burial or anything. So we just kept it at home.
All the Campbells could do was wait, not knowing if the medical examiner's office would identify and return any more remains of Jeff. By October 2002, the families of over 1,300 victims were still waiting in the desperate hope that any clues, any remains, might help bring closure. Jacqueline Fanning's father, Fire Chief Jack Fanning, was last seen in the lobby of the South Tower, setting up a command center to coordinate the evacuation.
Knowing that there were people alive in that building, he would never have left. That didn't surprise me at all. We waited really thinking they were going to find them, but they never found my dad. The first 3 years after it, I couldn't deal with it. I got very involved in drugs and alcohol and just couldn't keep it together. My whole life fell apart.
With such a profound sense of loss, Jacqueline was desperate for anything that could help her feel some kind of connection with her lost father.
This is my dad's helmet that was found at the site at Ground Zero. You could see it's melted and burnt, crushed. And the fire department called me, and to see it, I was scared to see it. It doesn't really look like a helmet anymore. And thank God I have it, because it's the only thing I have. You just kind of accept that you don't have anything back, you know? And then you kind of get scared to get the phone call that they have remains, because you're scared for all of it to be reopened again. We had his memorial at a church on October 6th of 2001, and I didn't want a coffin because I didn't want one with nothing in it. It did not bring any closure for me, that's for sure.
With the families of 1,300 victims still waiting, the medical examiner continued to test over 9,700 unidentified fragments. Though their success rate was slowing down, matches continued to be made. But by this stage, many were repeat identifications. On the 20th of July 2004, 3 more parts of Jeff were identified and sent home to his family.
So we've had 2 of these caskets come back. Each bag has a part number on it. You can actually see his name's actually on there, and the body part number. So that part number, you know, is a unique number for each individual piece of remains that has been found. You know, when we opened them, there's just that very odd, slightly chemical but slightly musty, sort of decaying smell.
At Matt's request, the lab sent the file on his brother's remains.
This one is his right scapula. And this one here is his femur. And this one is his sacrum.
These 3 pieces of shoulder, leg and pelvis had enormous significance for the Campbells. The family could finally give Jeff a Catholic burial.
On the day that the casket was placed, we had 31 roses. He was 31 years old when he died, white roses. My mum and dad, who were in their 90s, came along, and one by one, we put the roses here.
It was a very lovely service. I was glad the family had something to bring back home. But I distinctly remember that day. It brought me back to like when it first happened.
In 3 years, only 162 new identifications had been made, leaving 1,159 families with nothing. For them, what happened next came as a terrible blow. On April the 22nd, 2005, the medical examiner's office sent a letter explaining the investigation was coming to a halt.
We had exhausted the technology at the time. It wasn't advanced enough for us to generate DNA profiles from highly degraded bone fragments that were exposed to all these elements at World Trade Center. So the decision was, let's not continue, because at that point, you're not going to make any more identifications, you're just going to use bone sample.
For relatives still waiting, like Charles Wolfe, whose wife Catherine lost her life on the 96th floor of the North Tower, this news was painfully hard to bear.
If we reach the limits of science, and they're going to take a breather until new things are developed and go back, I take them at their word. I took them at their word. And so there's nothing else one can do.
For the director of the medical examiner's lab, it was the end of the road. Bob Shaler retired in 2005. The investigation had left an indelible mark.
I still remember the day that we had the closing of the World Trade Center site. And the people were all standing and they were all cheering for us. And I don't feel like a hero. I didn't feel like I belonged in that parade. I felt like I should have been in the laboratory because we had so much work to do yet. And while we were standing down there, waiting to finish the ceremonies, the swirl of wind came through. It just swirled through the whole World Trade Center site and just went up into the sky. And it felt like it just felt like the spirits were being taken out. That's how I looked at it.
On Bob Shayler's watch, the remains of nearly 1,600 9/11 victims had been identified and returned home. But there were still hundreds of families hoping for something, anything, to help ease their loss. Then, just 7 months later, a discovery that brought sudden, unexpected hope.
Construction workers prepare to demolish a 41-story bank building heavily damaged on September 11th. As many as 300 tiny pieces of human bone fragments have been found in the building.
But could this incredible discovery really change everything? After surviving the terrible events of 9/11 and then lying exposed for 4 years, could these precious human fragments ever be identified? In spring 2005, the mission to identify the human remains recovered from Ground Zero had ground to a halt. Forensic scientists had exhausted current technology. But New York could not wait. Reconstruction of the World Trade Center site was ready to begin. Then, in September 2005, construction workers clearing the roof of the condemned Deutsche Bank made a remarkable discovery. Mixed in with the gravel appeared to be fragments of bone.
I went up on the rooftop. I was able to confirm that indeed they were bone fragments, and they, although small, looked like there was a good potential that they were human.
Brad and his team painstakingly sifted and collected every scrap. In 6 months, they found 783 body parts at the site.
So this is the location of the Deutsche Bank here. Here is the footprint of the North Tower, South Tower, and Deutsche Bank is right here. So this is where there was that discovery of the bone fragments on the rooftop.
The Deutsche Bank was 400 feet from the Twin Towers. So how had these remains got there?
We went back and we analyzed the film of the planes hitting the building, and you can see the fireball.
When the first plane hit the North Tower, in the explosion, wreckage was thrust out of the other side. Was it conceivable human remains were then carried past the South Tower and onto the roof of the Deutsche Bank?
We were sifting through. We would occasionally find pieces of greenish metal that looked consistent with what I've seen in the past with airplane wreckage.
The evidence pointed to the remains coming from the passengers and crew of American Airlines Flight 11, the plane that hit the North Tower. But identifying who each fragment belonged to was impossible with current techniques.
Fragments had been sitting for 5 years, exposed to the sun and the rain and everything that destroys DNA. So the amount of DNA that was going to be in these was going to be very, very small amounts.
The team needed to try something new. They turned to liquid nitrogen, first freezing the bones before turning them to powder.
So that freezing process will make the bone fragment very brittle. We want to shatter those bone fragments and help us pulverize it and mill it, grind it into a very fine powder. The more fine the powder, the more access to the cells we're going to have.
Turning the bone into exceptionally fine talc was a breakthrough.
I was amazed at the results, the amount of DNA profiles we could generate from those. I never would have thought that we would be that successful.
As a result, the families of 30 of the passengers and crew aboard American Airlines Flight 11 received remains of their loved ones. But for the medical examiner's office, the implications of this dramatic new technique were huge. In June 2007, they announced every unidentified piece of human remains, all 10,000 of them, would now be retested.
Going back to all the remains, let's try it again. Something we've tried 5 times, let's do it again. Apply the new technology and see what you can get.
In just 18 months, they re-examined every single fragment, teasing out DNA where none could be found before. And they got results. In March 2008, the Campbell family in Sussex received news from New York. Another part of Jeff would be coming home.
This one sort of threw us a bit because it wasn't a bone fragment. It was his hair and scalp and other bits of soft tissue and stuff. So you can sort of make out there, and that's obviously his hair and his scalp. And that was his right mandible with, I think there's three teeth there. And this was a lot harder to deal with. I actually remember the gasp that Mum took when she looked at this.
It was a shock, but I really felt he'd really come home.
This piece of Jeff eased Maureen's greatest fear, that her son had suffered in the fires that raged before the Twin Towers fell.
My fear was that he was in these terrible flames and had to make decisions what to do, or was burnt. And the fact that it wasn't singed at all, the hair, you'd have thought that would have been a little bit singed or anything like that. It really did bring me comfort, but I think, no, I was really quite at ease. He had black sort of spiky hair, and he had it about that length. And remember you cut some, we put it in a locket for me, and I felt really at peace with that.
The Campbells were not the only family to receive more remains. A further 1,757 fragments were identified using the new technique. 25 more families were reunited with parts of their loved ones for the first time. By the end of 2008, 1,623 victims had been identified. But that left over 40% of the families with nothing to bury, and a painful dilemma for New York City planners. Over the years, fierce debate raged over what to build on the desolate site at Ground Zero. In the summer of 2006, construction began on a memorial plaza and museum complex designed to honor all those who had lost their lives here. At the same time, another controversial decision was made by the city of New York, that all the unidentified remains would be transferred in May 2014 to an underground repository next to the new museum. This was greeted with horror by some of the families. Michael Burke is still waiting for the remains of his firefighter brother, Billy.
Remains are supposed to be treated with a sort of sacredness and reverence. To have a gift shop here and then down the hall, Billy Burke's remains, is just strange.
This is the only place we have. Nothing left, Scott, as of right now, that we know of. When you're going to put human remains 70 feet below ground zero, what were you thinking about? This is not something you gawk at. These are people, human people, who died on 9/11. Those remains belong in the medical examiner's office until they find out who they are.
But 13 years on, with the latest testing coming to an end, can there really still be hope for the families who have nothing? In the medical examiner's lab, time is running out and the pressure is on. But they're not giving up.
The amounts we're working with are very small at this point. These are all samples that we've attempted multiple times.
A third phase of testing began in 2013 with a newly refined DNA extraction process. Incubation, where samples are heated and cooled over many hours, is producing results where other methods failed.
We've learned that the longer it incubates, the better the DNA yield. This isn't something that can be done in a day. It does take, several days to complete the step. This has been a big step for us to work with samples in the past gave us zero chance for generating a profile.
It's a slow and painstaking process, but in July 2013, 4 new victims were identified.
For my family, for my parents, for my brother, for his wife and his son, I take it as a sign that he's okay.
But new identifications have become rare, and so far in 2014, there have been none. And by the end of the year, all 8,000 unidentified remains will have been tested using the latest techniques.
At some point this year, we hope to finish that, apply this new technology to all the remains and see, how many identifications we made, how many more victims need to be identified.
Jacqueline Fanning still has no news of her firefighter father.
Good boy, Sham.
And she fears that when the last unidentified remains are transferred to the new repository, it will mark the end of the search. Today, she's calling the lab directly.
I'm nervous about making the phone call, but I want to know if anything new has gone on, 13 years later that I haven't been notified about. Yeah, I'm nervous. I'm nervous of what they're going to say to me on the phone. Hi, how you doing? I was just looking to see if I can get information. I'm Jack Fanning's daughter.
But the news from the medical examiner's office is not positive.
Mm-hmm. They have 8,000 remains. They're going to keep trying to identify those 8,000 remains, and with as much as they can with technology now. So there is a chance that it will happen, but there's a big chance that it won't.
By May 2014, New York is preparing for a solemn day of remembrance. And to some, it appears the 9/11 story is finally ending. But the quest to identify remains has not been abandoned, and recent discoveries are giving hope to families with nothing. Today, the physical scar of Ground Zero has healed, with a new 9/11 memorial and museum built on the site. Matt Campbell, whose brother Jeff died in the attacks, has come to New York to attend the opening ceremony. In December 2013, scientists identified a 6th fragment of Jeff's body. But the Campbells have decided it should stay in New York, where he lived with his fiancée, Caroline.
Once we found out that his remains were going to be moved to the museum as a permanent resting place, we made the decision to keep his remains here and not repatriate them back to the UK. Mainly so that, if and when Caroline eventually felt that she could bring herself to come down to World Trade, she would actually effectively have a grave, somewhere to go where, knowing that Jeff's actually there.
Jeff's family explained to me that, they're going to leave part of his remains here. It is a comfort to know that part of him is still here in New York, I guess.
But Jeff's brother, Matt, still has many questions about the investigation.
Can I go to 30th and 1st, please?
And while he's here, he wants to get some answers.
We had a bone identified last year. Why has it taken until 2013 to identify Jeff from that bone fragment? Seems a long time. It is a long time.
Today, he's heading to the medical examiner's office for a private meeting with them.
Why, out of the blue, last year, did we get another part of Jeff identified? And they said that was something to do with a change of techniques. This is the 3rd sort of tranche or cycle they've been through sampling.
So more of Jeff's remains may yet be identified.
The majority of people identified, it's more common that they've had multiple remains rather than just 1 or 2, which obviously surprised me.
It's May the 10th, 2014. Today, 8,000 human remains, unidentified or unclaimed, will be taken from the medical examiner's office to their final resting place at Ground Zero. They include part of Jeff Campbell's upper arm.
I mean, I know that Jeff has been identified and we've not claimed him. He's going to be there in that final funeral procession, and then his remains are going to be placed, in the repository forever. For me, it's the final resting place for Jeff.
When I first saw what came out, which was effectively a coffin, it brought it home that this is, a final funeral march.
But it's a ceremony that Jeff's partner Caroline feels unable to attend. She has never been back to Ground Zero since Jeff's death.
There is a little bit of comfort knowing that there's a place I can, when I'm ready to get down to honor his memory.
Since 9/11, New York's medical examiner's office has carried out one of the most groundbreaking forensic investigations ever. Over the past 13 years, 21,906 fragments of human remains have been recovered from Ground Zero and from searches in a 2-block radius of where the Twin Towers stood. They've successfully identified and returned these precious fragments to the families of 60% of the 2,753 victims who died. Their work has pushed back the boundaries of science.
There's a lot of technology that we apply to our homicide investigations or our missing persons investigations that we've helped identify or solve based on what we've learned from World Trade Center. So it has advanced forensic science greatly.
Current techniques will once again be exhausted by the end of this year, but relics from 9/11 are still being uncovered. On April the 24th, 2013, a piece of the landing gear from the plane that crashed into the World Trade Center was discovered, jammed between two buildings a block from Ground Zero.
I just saw a piece of mechanical equipment, wreckage. After it sunk in, I realized it was actually like a piece of a murder weapon. How many other parts are around here? They thought maybe there was, pieces of DNA evidence, like pieces of bones and everything.
The medical examiner's office is hoping to excavate new areas on the edge of Ground Zero and continue testing if new techniques are developed.
This team is committed, as committed today as it was in 2001, to making these identifications, and we will do that. Continue to advance the systems and see if we reach a point where we can go back and start generating DNA profiles on remains that we haven't been successful with.
For the families of over 1,000 victims, the wait goes on.
My wife was stuck in 2001. 9/11 devastated my family. Now, if she could get parts of her son back, it'd be a miracle.
I would still want the call even if it was 25 years later. I would want to know.
It would be kind of interesting to find out if they called me up and said, we got something. It would be a rush of emotion, I imagine. But really, what they did that day.
So many other fathers that were down there and they never recovered anything. I felt, they're asking me, do you feel good that you found them? There's no closure. I mean, he's not going to walk back in the room. So he's still gone. My heart aches every day. But at least I have a cemetery I can go to and I'll sit there and talk to him, or I'll come here and talk out there.
You cannot give up hope. You have to keep going and going. Once you give up hope, it's all over. You're finished.